Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has unveiled concessions in order to reach peace and end the war with Russia.
What changed in Kyiv this week was not a map, not a front line, and not the sound of artillery in eastern Ukraine. What changed was the language. For the first time since the war began, President Volodymyr Zelensky publicly described a future in which Ukrainian troops would voluntarily step back from parts of the Donetsk region they still control, transforming that land into a demilitarized zone in the hope of ending the war. It was a moment that marked the sharpest turn yet, from defiance toward conditional compromise, and it immediately reshaped the diplomatic landscape surrounding the conflict. Speaking in Kyiv, Zelensky laid out a revised peace proposal that had been developed over weeks of negotiations with the United States. At its core was a calculated offer. Ukraine would withdraw its forces from certain fortified areas of eastern Donetsk, but only if Russia agreed to do the same on its side of the front. Between the two, an internationally administered demilitarized zone would emerge, separating Ukrainian and Russian forces and freezing the conflict without formally resolving the question of sovereignty. For a war defined by absolutist claims and zero-sum objectives, this was a significant departure. Donetsk has always been the war's most difficult puzzle. It is not just territory, it is a symbol, a battlefield, and a political red line for both sides. Russia has repeatedly stated that full control of the region is non-negotiable. Ukraine, meanwhile, has insisted it cannot surrender land that remains under its authority without betraying its citizens and its soldiers. Every previous peace initiative stumbled over this same ground. Zelensky's new proposal does not abandon Ukraine's claim to Donetsk, but it acknowledges a reality that has become harder to ignore. Neither side has been able to impose a decisive outcome there. The proposed demilitarized zone would likely include cities such as Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which together form Ukraine's last major defensive belt in eastern Donetsk. These cities are heavily scarred by war, their streets lined with shattered buildings and abandoned homes, yet they remain strategically vital. Pulling troops back from them would be an extraordinary risk, one that Ukraine would not take without ironclad guarantees. Zelensky made it clear that any such withdrawal would have to be reciprocal, verifiable, and overseen by international forces positioned inside the buffer zone itself. This offer forms part of a broader 20-point peace framework that stretches beyond territory alone. It addresses security guarantees meant to prevent future Russian aggression, outlines plans for post-war reconstruction, and attempts to anchor American and European economic interests directly into Ukraine's recovery. Zelensky described the plan as the closest Kyiv and Washington have come to a unified position since negotiations intensified, even though two major disputes remain unresolved: the future of Ukrainian-held areas in Donetsk and control of a major nuclear power plant currently occupied by Russia. That nuclear facility, located near the southern front line, adds another layer of complexity. It has been inactive since 2022, yet it remains the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, with the capacity to generate immense amounts of electricity. Zelensky revealed that the United States had floated the idea of joint American, Ukrainian, and Russian control of the plant. Kyiv rejected that structure, instead proposing a joint venture between Ukraine and Washington alone. It is a proposal almost certain to be dismissed by Moscow, but one that underscores how deeply economic leverage has become entwined with diplomacy. The Kremlin's initial reaction has been cold. Russian officials continue to insist that any settlement must recognize their full control over Donetsk, whether achieved militarily or through negotiations. Over the weekend, a senior Kremlin figure described the latest U.S.-Ukrainian talks as unconstructive, signaling little appetite for compromise. Yet Zelensky suggested that Russia may be constrained by politics beyond the battlefield. He argued that openly rejecting a peace initiative backed by the United States could carry consequences, particularly with President Donald Trump playing a central role in the negotiations. Zelensky's message was blunt. If Russia blocks a settlement, he said, Washington would be forced to respond by increasing military support to Ukraine and tightening sanctions. In that sense, the demilitarized zone proposal functions not only as a diplomatic olive branch, but as a test. It puts the burden of refusal squarely on Moscow, challenging it to explain why even a conditional path to peace is unacceptable. Inside Ukraine, the proposal raises deeply sensitive questions. Territory is not just a strategic asset. It is home to millions of people displaced by fighting, occupation, and bombardment. Any pullback risks creating new waves of displacement and raises fears that a frozen conflict could simply give Russia time to regroup. Zelensky acknowledged these concerns directly, stating that any decision to establish a demilitarized zone would require approval through a national referendum. In a country where the war has become a defining element of national identity, public consent is not a formality, but a necessity. The plan also envisions Ukraine's political reset once a peace deal is signed. Elections would be held as soon as conditions allow, ending the extension of Zelensky's presidential term under martial law. This element signals an effort to restore democratic normalcy, even as the country grapples with the aftermath of a prolonged war. It also serves as reassurance to Western partners that Ukraine's democratic institutions remain central to its future. Economic reconstruction plays a prominent role in the proposal, particularly in how it appeals to American interests. Zelensky described the demilitarized zone not as a wasteland, but as a potential free economic zone, open to investment and redevelopment. The language appears deliberately chosen, aligning with Washington's emphasis on economic returns and private sector involvement. A new reconstruction fund is envisioned, drawing on public and private capital, with ambitions reaching as high as $800 billion. The scale is staggering, and many details remain unresolved, but the intent is clear. Ukraine's recovery is being framed as both a moral obligation and a strategic opportunity. Security guarantees remain the backbone of Kyiv's demands. The plan calls for Ukraine to maintain a peacetime army of around 800,000 troops, funded with Western support. It reiterates Ukraine's goal of joining the European Union and outlines bilateral security commitments from the United States. European military backing would come through a coalition of willing nations prepared to support Ukraine's defenses on land, sea, and air. The possible deployment of European forces inside Ukraine, even in a post-war role, remains a red line for Moscow and one of the most explosive elements of the proposal. What emerges from this moment is not a clear path to peace, but a narrowing of uncertainty. Zelensky's offer does not resolve the war's core disputes, yet it represents the most explicit acknowledgement so far that compromise may be unavoidable. It is a gamble that diplomacy, pressure, and international alignment can achieve what force alone has not. Whether Russia engages with the proposal or dismisses it outright will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another footnote in a long and brutal conflict. For now, the front lines remain where they are, and the guns have not fallen silent. But in Kyiv, words have begun to move in directions they never have before. And in wars like this, that alone is a signal worth watching.